Hello everyone, this is Dr. August de Oliveira. In this 20-minute video, I'll be going over all the steps involved in making beautiful CEREC abutments and screw-retained crowns. If you want to learn more, come on out to Phoenix February 20 through the 22nd for a hands-on live patient digital implantology course with CEREC. So there's a bit of confusion in the market on scan bodies. And if you're not familiar with what a scan body is, a scan body is basically a digital impression coping. If you take an impression for an implant, you're screwing on a impression coping which then tells the lab where the implant is in space. We do the same thing digitally. Scan bodies are typically made of PEEK, which is a sterilizable plastic. They have a certain geometry which you need to capture, which then tells the software where the tie base is. One thing that's very important, which I've learned the hard way, is that for the most part, you have to use the same tie base which corresponds to the scan body, or the lab won't be able to match up the tie base that you're using. Pictured here is Implant Direct's new smart base system, which is a really cool system. It's anodized gold, so you don't have that ugly gray metal show through, and the gingival portion is pink, which hopefully you don't get any gum recession or dealing with a thin biotype, but you can definitely see it. To do a digital implant restoration, you typically have two portions. One is a tie base and some sort of ceramic which goes on top. That ceramic could be zirconia, it could be Emax, or some type of polymer like Vita Enamic that's cemented on a sandblasted tie base. One question I get a lot is, well, why don't you make the entire abutment or the entire screw-retained crown out of zirconia, eliminating the need for a tie base to be cemented? Although it's widely used, I'm not a huge fan, just because we're cranking down implant abutments, torquing them to 30 Newton centimeters or a little less. And I worry about the zirconia cracking or breaking. Also, we don't get the benefit of cold welding, which you get with a metal-on-metal interface. So what's the sequence? Whether you're using CEREC or really any other digital impressioning system, there's obviously a scan of the scan body, but also, which is helpful, especially if you shape the tissue, is getting a separate scan of just the tissue. Doing so, you obviously get the gums in there, which you need, but you can better visualize the interproximal contacts, especially in cases like the lower anterior, or if you're using a fairly large scan body. One thing that's important is to obviously get the bite. Tough to do with the scan body in. So if your software, if you're using a system other than CEREC, allows you, it's best to take the bite when you're scanning for the gingival mask. I'm going to cover going over either designing what we call a split file restoration, which is a separate abutment piece and a separate crown piece, but also you do have the option of a completely screw-retained restoration. Definitely an optional step and definitely a 2-appointment deal, but sometimes I find it helpful to print an implant analog model that contains the gingival mask just so I can check everything before it goes in the patient's mouth. I can also do the next step, which is cementing the tie base to the ceramic before the patient gets in there. On some odd chances, the cement hardens before you've seated your ceramic framework on the tie base. I at least have time to stop, try to separate them if I can, or at least remill parts. But today we're going to be going over chairside implant restorations. Can you make restorations for implants on any type of implant in CEREC? Well, the short answer is no. There are a few supported tie bases. These are just a few. But if you're a Nobel user, we've got some options for Nobel. We've just gotten our Astra EV tie bases FDA approved for the Primecsan. Sirona sells both the EV and the TX lines. If you're a Xive user, there's a Freelit Xive tie base. Straumann, tissue level and bone level, although I will admit tissue level is pretty tough to do in CEREC. 3i. The TSV, or tapered screw vent from Zimmer, is a widely used compatible implant platform and one of my favorites with the Implant Direct Legacy line. BioHorizons have gotten approval as well with the new version 5.1 in Primecsan, so I'm excited to do some cases with BioHorizons. If you're an ankylose user, definitely get an option now. And Hyacin or Ostem as well. So I'm going to be a little critical here. I've used different types of scan bodies and have seen different types of designs. The one design that I'm definitely not a fan of is Sirona's. I hate to say it, but in my opinion, there's probably no worse tie base scan body combo on the market. I'm critical in two ways. One, our biggest fear is getting the implant scan body seated. We worry about getting the internal connection engaged and seated all the way. Sirona adds one more problem to it. It's a two-piece scan body. So you have to make sure that the scan body itself is down. And then you have to add this little cap, which also adds cost. You have to buy these, they're not meant to be reusable, and put these caps on in such a way that the two notches sort of match up. Sometimes this notch will be obscured by the interproximal, and it's just really tough to use. The second thing that I'm critical about this is it's made out of shiny metal. What's the hardest thing in the world to scan? You got it, shiny metal. So I'm hoping in the future we get some sort of maybe two-piece meaning one part peak, one part screw, instead of the three-piece design that we have, which is the scan post, the cap, and the screw. One workaround people have been doing is sandblasting the metal portion. Definitely not a bad idea. However, you'll sandblast off any sort of numbering that labels the implant platform on the side, which will really make yours and your dental assistant's lives a living hell. So what are the steps? Well, one of the things that I do first is take a look at how the implant was placed and see if I can do a screw retain restoration. Definitely a discussion for another video, but I am a big fan of screw retained restorations over cemented restorations because they're retrievable and there's no problem with cement sepsis. In this case here, you can see in the original CEREC Guide 2 plan that I had no choice but to have the screw access hole coming through the incisal edge. Definitely easy to get screw retains in the posterior. I find in the anterior, I'm probably over 50% abutment, 50% screw retain crowns. So a lot of times we're dealing with the abutments in the anterior. So when you go into the administration step, the first thing is to click on the little implant and choose between screw retain crown and multi-layer abutment. In general, always select multi-layer abutment because you can always make the choice between splitting and not splitting. We have to choose the abutment material. In this case, we're going to be doing it in zirconia. We have a choice between grinding and milling. Grinding is using diamonds, milling is using carbides. We can dry mill if you have that option on your milling unit. We always want to select the proper tie base. In this pull down menu, I don't have all the implant choices, but with the 5.1, you get quite a few, including MIS, which was not included in the slide before. We want to select scan post as our type and just make sure we've entered everything okay. One thing that's also somewhat annoying, in the mill preview, after you've designed your restoration, we no longer have control of where the sprue goes in screw-retained crowns. We never had it in abutments. So get in the habit of putting the notch on your scan post in the interproximal. That'll either put the sprue on the buccal or the lingual and make your life a little bit easier, especially when doing screw-retained crowns. The images on the left show the interproximal placement of that notch. The images on the right show you the notch coming from the facial and resulting in that sprue on the interproximal. So we have our sets of images that we took, as I mentioned before. In the upper jaw menu on this crown, we've decided to put in the gingival mask. The lower is the lower. You don't have to do a full arch, but for this video I did. 1 or 2 buccal bites are needed depending on how large of the arch you've captured. And finally, in the scan body file, you want to scan that scan post. So why not just do an abutment? Stock abutments are cheap, they're easy. Why not just put one of those on, powder it up or sandblast it, and go ahead and scan it? Well, one thing that I'll speak a lot on is the gingival emergence profile and how you can alter that in the CEREC program. Teeth aren't cylindrical, so molars are rectangular, premolars are oval in shape, and anterior teeth are triangular. And there's certain steps that we have to go through after we take our images to make sure that we get that emergence profile looking good. So we can take our bite, confirm our bite, line our models up. I like the second premolars in the area where the 2 circles overlap. I check to see my midline's right on and my occlusal plane looks good. And then we can pop over to click the scan body head. One thing in the past, Sirona has advocated that you only have to get the top of the scan cap. I would argue that it's a really good idea to get the sides as well. One, you can visually confirm that your notches have lined up between that peak cap and the post itself. I'll go over in the next slide how to alter the baseline. So what's the baseline? So the baseline marks really the junction between a crown and the abutment. If you're doing a screw-retained crown, it defines what is subgingival. And it really boils down to what you've done as far as shaping the gingiva. In the posterior, you can definitely get away with putting on a cylindrical healing abutment or lasering the tissue to uncover the implant and sort of guessing that subgingival portion. But in the anterior, it's really important that you shape the tissue and get a pretty good idea where those papillae will be. So we have a choice between ignoring the gingival mask or using the gingival mask when developing the emergence profile, and that's in the baseline. And so in this case here, we use the gingival mask. And if we go forward, you can see that the subgingival portion of this proposal is just a carbon copy of the tissue that we defined. If you feel that the way you've built your tooth up is sort of skinny, you may choose to ignore it. One other nice thing is if you use a gingival mask, you don't have a lot of work in defining where your abutment and crown are. But if we go back and ignore our gingival mask and just utilize what CEREC feels is a good subgingival portion, then we have maybe a little bit of work to do later on. Again, if you haven't shaped the tissue, this is super helpful because it'll give you sort of a nice fat gingival profile that you can pare down or change later on. But the big issue is when you go forward, you've got to redraw that baseline. It's going to arbitrarily set it, usually to supragingival, which is maybe something you want. But if you're using dissimilar materials, like let's say zirconia for the abutment and Emax for the crown, it gets to be unaesthetic. So now you got to go back in and redefine this. When you're dealing with the anterior, there are a lot of systems out there that have angled screw channels that'll allow you to still do screw retain restorations even if you have an off-axis implant. Unfortunately, we don't have that option. So here we can see that the screw hole is going through the facial of my restoration, which is a no-go aesthetically. So we want to change this to a split file. So if we come down, first off, actually, we have to probably shape this thing up. It's a little deficient in the cervical area compared to the other teeth, so we can pull this area out. This is a common area where we have problems with the thickness of ceramic around our abutments. So if you can tolerate it aesthetically, if it's a little fatter in this area, go ahead and bulk it out. We can remove any occlusion. I'm sure there's lots of debate still on occlusion on implant restorations, but I like mine out of occlusion if I can, putting less force on the implant because it doesn't have a PDL. We can turn off our upper jaw, look at the subgingival portion. Looks like I have a little bit of work there, but let's just go ahead and skip to splitting the restoration. And we can access that in our tools under split. Looks like I need to add a little contact in this area. This patient doesn't have a lot of papillae, so we don't have to mimic what's not there, but we do want to close that up. So now we can go to split. And so splitting the file, we access it by clicking on the split tool. If we're happy with where that green line is, we can go ahead and just split it. I personally like mine to be 1 millimeter subgingival. And you can see now that we get a warning saying, hey, the way things are, it's a little too thin. You want me to help you out and bulk out some areas? We want to say yes, because you can go through the entire design process, and by the time you get to the mill, if it's not thick enough, it won't let you mill. It'll just kick you back to the design. But you can see here that we've got a fairly thick margin, and I'd rather have a thinner margin than have something crack. So the shoulder width is default at 1,000 microns. We can dial that back to 600 microns, which is the minimum thickness of the restoration we need. And we can hit OK, and that's going to go ahead and bulk out our restoration in that area. And you can see here we've got a little bit more thickness around the tie base itself. Now we can access the scale tool, which the scale tool will allow us to make that restoration thicker or thinner. And so just looking at my restoration here. And if we come over to scale and we scale radially, we can change that. Oops, come back here. And so when we hit scale, we can select scale hole. Scale hole will bring our restoration out around the entire circumference of the abutment. And we can bulk that out a little bit. Remember, the fatter you make the abutment, the thinner the crown will be. So find a little happy medium. If we scale occlusally, we can give us a little bit more thickness of our restoration, but we need to be careful so that we don't have too much tie base show through. When we get to mill, we'll get a warning saying, hey, our restoration is too thin, and do you want to go back and change things? It's really kind of a dumb message because it doesn't let you change things or doesn't let you mill things unless you make your abutment a little thicker. CEREC computes the timing or how the implant is rotated in space. And so here you can see that we have our sprue automatically sprued, and our restoration is ready to mill. One thing that I found out the hard way is with zirconia, you need to enter in the barcode. You can find that on the block itself. I do have a mill that has a barcode reader that has never worked. So you have to make sure you manually enter in that barcode. And there you have it. So on February 20 through the 22nd, we'll be doing a 3-day course at Implant Pathway, and you can register at implantpathway.com. Day 1 is all guided surgery, so we'll be spending the majority of the time on milled CEREC Guide 2 surgical guides, as well as 3D printed surgical guides with a very low cost software. Day 2 is all about restorative, so we'll be learning how to do what the video has shown you, as well as screw retain crowns and the sequences involved in full arch prosthetics like overdentures or hybrids, as well as dentures. Day 3 is where things get exciting. We'll be doing live patient implants, so you'll get to place an implant on a patient using CEREC Guide 2. You'll be scanning scan posts for restorations and delivering ones that we had made for you before. And then finally, you'll get to see in action how I scan for hybrids and overdentures. So please come, again, Implant Pathways in Phoenix, February 20 through the 22nd.